Dude, this is 76 years. You need to be mad at Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, Nixon. There was a European and an American sense that we can never let there be another Middle East superpower.
The amount of firepower they've used, the amount of firepower they're using in Lebanon.
We tend to go for the economic explanation too quickly and too often.
Do you have time for one tweak
Sure,
on that?
go for it. We have
Right?
to. I know I'm over, but
Right. I mean, okay, look.
the most important part is that Saudi Arabia promises it will never cut off the supply of oil to the United States. I'm also not a sociologist, I'm a political scientist.
Okay, so historian and political scientist.
Yeah, sociologists are nice people, political scientists are gross. So I don't want people to misunderstand the nature. What is it about some people? They're obsessed with corruption and incompetence and they want to study it. You know, usually you want to study how to make the world a better place.
I mean, I don't want to stop you from speaking because from what I've seen, you like to speak, and the reason why I'm contacting you is because I like to see you speak. So it's not like it's a problem. Okay, we good?
I hope so.
Okay, let's begin in 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today, I'm joined by Roy Casagranda, who's a historian and political scientist. You may have seen him on the internet. He's the founder of the Austin School lecture series, which he's rebranding at the moment, where he's hosted a series of lectures dealing extensively with history, but specifically the history of the Arab world and the Middle East. Professor Roy Casagranda, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for giving us your time. Today we're going to have quite a long discussion. It's going to be based around, I think what we're trying to do is try to understand why the Middle East how it is based on the history of the last 100 years, but specifically because of UK and US interference, but more specifically US interference, just because it's the more recent interference in the last 70 years. I want to start off by just asking you, there's a clip and we'll actually play it for our audience, but what you say in the clip is the following. It's about the Eisenhower doctrine, which I think is something we're going to discuss quite in depth today. You say,
the Eisenhower doctrine establishes that there's a priority before communism. And that priority is to destroy the French and British empires. Let that sink in for a moment. We want to destroy the empires of the two states that were our allies. Our number 2 priority is to prevent Pan-Arabism from succeeding and to prevent the Arabs from unifying and creating a single state. Then after that, we're fighting communism.
Unpack for us what the motivations of the Eisenhower doctrine were exactly.
When you think about it, World War II is, the Spanish-American War is the debutante ball. The United States goes in there, beats up Grandpa, puts Grandpa in his place, and says, here we are, we just defeated a European state. World War I, the United States plays an important role. They come in late, right? Let the war go 3/4 of the way through and then come in the last quarter and be the hero of the day. But it wasn't clear yet that we were going to be the superpower that we became. World War II happens. Europe is in ruins, the whole place. Mass carnage, whole cities are destroyed. And the United States realizes that even though we're going to play this game like the Russians are our rivals, that the reality is that it's a hegemonic world from this point on. The United States is the single true superpower. That the Soviet Union at some level is a paper tiger. And so what Eisenhower wants to do is he wants to reframe the world and sort of create I'm going to use a term that's been used more recently, but Pax Americana. And so he changes what Truman had been thinking. Truman thought the goal is to sort of isolate the Soviet Union and lock the Soviet Union in. What Eisenhower is thinking is, no, we want to replace the British and French empires. We want to become the new sole superpower. And how do we make that happen? I'm not exactly sure why Eisenhower thought fighting Pan-Arabism was so important, but I think there is a psychological thing in there. By the time we get to the Eisenhower administration, it's clear that there's a lot of petroleum in the Middle East. Right? There's no question about that at all. So part of it is obviously that. But here's the problem. We tend to go for the economic explanation too quickly and too often. There's almost always another explanation that isn't economic. Part of the problem is that the Arab world is majority Muslim, and there's this sort of historical background of anti-Muslim feelings in Europe, and then of course that gets sent to the United States. So that exists, and it's also built into the United States. In the 1760 census, the American colonies, Islam was the third largest religion, and so it went I think it went Baptist Methodist, but if I'm wrong about that, it's Methodist Baptist. And then number 3 was Islam. And so, part of the American colonial experience was how do we de-Muslimize the slave population and Christianize them? So there's this sort of deep-seated anti-Muslim feeling that's part of this as well. But I think there's another piece. If you go back in time, all the way to about 5,100 years ago, with the exception of really the last 150 or so years, the Middle East has always been host to one of the world's superpowers. And I think after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, whether people said it out loud or not, that there was a European and an American sense that we can never let there be another Middle East superpower, that this has to end, this can't go on. So one of the problems that Truman was facing was the fear that the United States had that there was going to be a World War III, but that World War III would be against Germany and Japan, and that the United States might not win World War III against Germany and Japan. So for Truman, the goal was, how do we contain Germany and Japan? How do we make Germany and Japan into US vassal states that we can control? Eisenhower, began to fear that if this pan-Arab movement that was taking hold actually worked, we would have another problem, and it would be that there would be a new Middle East superpower on the block, and he just needed to make sure that didn't happen.
Most readings that we are exposed to in schools and universities and in the media about history is that the US for the last 50 years of the 21st century was mainly concerned with communism, and they obviously were to a very large extent. Wikipedia says this about the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is very different to what you've just said. It says, under the Eisenhower Doctrine, a Middle Eastern country could request American economic assistance or aid from the US military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression. Eisenhower singled out the Soviet threat in his doctrine by authorizing the commitment of US forces to secure and protect the territorial integrity and political independence of such nations, requesting such aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. Why is the world how it is that your interpretations and Wikipedia's interpretations are just so different?
Okay, because Wikipedia is doing the official line, and I'm reading through the lines, between the lines. So I'll give you some examples. First of all, if you want to dive deeper into this, the work written by Bob Vitalis does a better job probably than what I'm doing here, talking to you about going into the little details about how Eisenhower did this, and why Eisenhower did this. But I'll give you some examples. So actually, let me just give you really two examples. So one is what happens in 1956. President Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, and he does it for economic reasons. He wants to build the Aswan High Dam. He doesn't have the money to do it. Egypt purchased World War II material from Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was in a communist state. Great Britain used that as an excuse to cut off funding for the Aswan High Dam. So then Nasser, there was funding coming from the United States and Great Britain. Nasser goes to the United States and says, are you going to still fund your half? The United States says, Eisenhower says, no, if the British aren't funding their half, we're not going to fund our half. So that ends funding for the Aswan High Dam. Egypt is too poor to build it on its own. So he nationalizes Suez Canal so that the revenue from the canal will then go fund the dam. When that happens, the United Kingdom and France attack Egypt I'm sorry, Israel attacks Egypt first. Israel attacks Egypt, including dropping paratroopers into the Sinai. And the hope was that the Egyptian military would be lured across the Suez Canal into the Sinai to defend the Sinai from Israel. Nasser doesn't fall for the bait. The French goal was to then capture the Suez Canal and trap the Egyptian army on the wrong side. And because Nasser doesn't fall for the bait, the French and British, when they do finally invade, they're not fighting any Egyptian military force. They're just grabbing territory. And Egypt isn't resisting. It's allowing this to happen. Eisenhower steps in on Egypt's side. So here's the United, a friend of the United States, an ally of the United States, two NATO members, and then Israel attacking a state that has had relations with a communist country, in this case, Czechoslovakia, and Eisenhower is taking Egypt's side, intervening on Egypt's behalf, going to the United Nations, getting a United Nations force to go to the Sinai, and humiliating and shaming the British. So in that particular instance, if Eisenhower's real fear was the expansion of Soviet influence in the Middle East, he might not have taken Egypt's side. He might have gone a different direction. So that's one example. Another example is what happens in 1958. So 1958 is it just seems like there are these years where a lot of things happen all at once, and then there's periods where a little bit's happening here and there, and then all of a sudden there's another year where a lot of things happen at once. So 1958 is one of those years. Egypt and Syria unify. The Sudan gets independence from Egypt. So it's like going in two different directions at the same time. Iraq is in the middle of a revolution where they're overthrowing their monarchy. And Iraq is saying that it's planning on the other side of this to probably join the United Arab Republic and join Egypt and Syria. Iraq is also saying that it wants to annex Kuwait in 1958. So there's a lot going on. All of a sudden, the United States sends in the Marine Corps and they invade Lebanon. So if the Eisenhower doctrine was, we're going to defend you and we're going to defend you from invasion, who got invaded? Well, what was the invasion? Nobody invaded Syria. Nobody invaded Iraq. There was no reason to invade Lebanon. His excuse was, we're trying to prevent a civil war. But there was no civil war. There was a political struggle happening in Lebanon, but there wasn't a civil war. There was a movement in Lebanon to possibly also join Egypt and Syria as well, just like in Iraq. But what I think he was really doing was he was doing a show of force. If you do this, bad things will happen. We'll literally invade your country. Also, he dropped the threat that he was willing to bomb Iraq, nuke Iraq, actually, in the event that Iraq did invade Kuwait. And then, as if to make things weirder, there were, in the Iraqi revolution, the socialists were poised to take over, and they do take over parliament. So what Eisenhower does is he, instead of backing the monarchists, instead of backing the socialists, he backs the communists. CIA is sending the communists money. And the reason is because he believes, and rightly so, that the communists, if they're powerful enough, they'll prevent Iraq from joining the United Arab Republic. Well, if his priority is stopping communism, why would he back the communists? In the end, it works and Iraq doesn't join. And then 3 years later, the United Arab Republic implodes and Syria declares its independence. And so in 1958, he sort of just shows his hand. He shows what his priorities are. His priorities are to prevent the United Arab Republic from forming. He's willing to work with communists to make that happen.
We want to kind of move forward, but before we do that, we'll move forward to where we start speaking about U.S. interference specifically in the various countries in the Middle East. But before we actually get there, I think it's important, and you'd probably agree, to kind of just paint a picture of just what the Middle East is, who Arab peoples are, and also just what happened between 1920 roughly and 1950, where these states were birthed and how they were actually birthed.
Okay, so in the 7th century, the religion of Islam is born, and an Arab army leaves the Arabian Peninsula right after the death of the Prophet Mohamed. And that Arab army attacks the Persian Empire, defeats the Persian army in what is today Western Iraq, That Arab army then joins another Arab army that had already invaded Palestine, and that Arab army will defeat the Romans in Palestine and Syria. In the aftermath of this, subsequent wars, or it's really the same war, but subsequent leaders in the Arab world will eventually conquer all of the Persian Empire, and they will conquer a huge chunk of the Roman Empire. They almost get the whole Roman Empire, but they don't quite finish it off. The result of this is that culturally, linguistically, everything from Morocco to Iraq, including parts of Iran and going quite far south, so that there's actually areas in Somalia and Eritrea and Chad, Mauritania, that area speaks Arabic, and as a result has an Arab identity marker. So it might be worth defining the word nation. A nation is a group of people with a common identity. That's the first and most important piece to being a nation. You have to say, I am. So if you say, I am Danish, right? You're claiming your national identity. I am Arab. You're claiming your national identity. That's the first piece. The second piece is you probably want to have a common language. Now, there's variation on this, and these are human constructs, the idea of a nation. So you'll find exceptions to this. For example, let's say you're a German American. You might still identify as German because you are ethnically German and not speak any German whatsoever. So in other words, it's a little fuzzy here, but language is really important because you kind of need to be able to speak to the people from your nation. The next three pieces are you have common traditions, common history, and a common DNA. Again, you're going to find exceptions to this, but as a general rule, people from the same nation tend to have similar skin color, similar hair. They tend to look similar cheekbone structure, similar nose structure. In other words, what a nation usually is it's a group of first, second, and third cousins who keep having sex with each other and making babies that look like each other. In other words, when Hitler got up and said, I want to make the German nation pure, what he was really saying is, I want to have the German nation as inbred as German shepherds, which is obviously an awful idea. We don't want to do this, but that's kind of the core of what a nation is. A nation tends to be a relatively closed off gene pool with a common history. In the case of Arabs, there's a little bit of a big exception here. So Egyptians are not genetically the same as people living in Arabia, who aren't the same as people living in Syria, who aren't the same as people living in Morocco. Arabs have really wide variety of skin colors, facial features. In other words, it doesn't have the kind of homogeneity that I think most people are used to when they think about a nation. Culturally, there's huge variance, and even linguistically, there's huge variance. Because, if you speak Egyptian Arabic and you go to Morocco, they might understand you because they watch Egyptian TV and listen to Egyptian music, but you might have a difficulty understanding them. It's still the Arabic language, but the dialects get really, really profoundly different. But if you ask that Moroccan, assuming they're not a Berber, what are you? They'll probably say, I'm an Arab. And if you ask an Egyptian, what are you? They'll probably say, I'm an Arab, unless they're a Nubian. And in other words, the identity marker of Arab is still there. And that's the single most crucial part to whether or not you're a nation. So what happened was, in 1919, there was an uprising in Egypt where a group of initially it was actually Christian Egyptians, but it obviously spread very quickly to the Muslim population as well. These Christian Egyptians came up with the idea that we should create a single pan-Arab state that stretches from Mauritania to Iraq. It's secular, socialist, and promotes the Arab national identity. So that's where the Pan-Arabism comes from. The borders The borders are the result of a group of Europeans with a crayon and a napkin sitting around drawing random lines on the napkin and just chopping the Middle East up into little pieces. The goal always was divide and conquer. how can we take a population of people who are similar to each other, cut them up, put them in different states, and then have different empires rule them so that they are divided against each other. And then, if you can, clump them into uh, clump them with another group, right? And with the Arabs, they had a problem because if I carve Jordan off, I don't really have another ethnic group inside Jordan that I can clump them with. It didn't quite work the way I think they would have liked to, but they obviously had a lot more success in a place like Africa. But nonetheless, that was the goal. So the goal was to make these artificial states, create the borders in such a way that it harmed as many people as possible. I think you're going to ask a question that goes into the details more, so I'll stop
Yeah,
it
yeah.
there.
No, no. I mean, look, I'm about to do that, but I just want to take you back just to just one step, because I think what you kind of said this in the start, that it's not just about economics, right? Which is often how colonialism is sometimes explained, or at least the aftermath of post-colonialism explained, in terms of what's in terms of your best in your financial interests or your economic interests. So the thing is, and I think a lot of this is also about, and you mentioned this already, about how the Western world views Arabs, right? And I think a lot of that is possibly in either misrepresentation or in a misunderstanding of the genesis of what you spoke about, this wide, broad Arab nation. In one of your earlier lectures that I've heard, I can't remember which one, but you actually say this. You say the initial Arab empire was, and I quote, shockingly non-Muslim and shockingly un-Arab entity. Can you just draw some light on that?
Yeah, so when the Muslim Arabs conquered the landmass, so by 711 they had conquered most of what is today Spain and all of Portugal, and they had actually conquered a little piece of southern France. So at that point, the Arab Empire went basically from Spain to roughly where the border between Pakistan and India are. Not exactly, but in that area. And it went into Central Asia. So this is a really big empire. It was the largest empire to that date. There had never been an empire larger. There have definitely been empires larger since. When the Arabs conquered that land, they didn't force anybody to convert. They didn't force anybody to change their language. The Arab, in fact, they were kind of, I think, shocked. I don't think the Arabs believed they could do what they did. And when they did it, I think they didn't know, like, okay, now what do we do? And so there was sort of this sense of, okay, the Romans and the Persians who are already here, who are already running the show, know what they're doing. Let's just leave them in place for the most part. Let them continue to rule at the local level. We'll make the big decisions at the top. And that's how they ran the empire. So in the first, by 711, maybe the Arab Empire was 5% Muslim. There was a large chunk of land that did speak Arabic. The Arabian Peninsula was mostly Arabic speaking, not entirely, but mostly. Iraq, Syria, and Palestine were mostly Arabic speaking. Before the Arabs made their empire, those places were already majority Arabic speaking. They were also majority Christian. So when the Arab Empire in its initial phases is conquering Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, it's actually conquering Christian Arab territory. And the number one combat force that they were fighting were Christian Arabs who fought for the Romans or Christian Arabs who fought for the Persians. So a lot of the original battles were actually just Arab versus Arab, with some Persian and Roman auxiliaries supporting the Christian Arabs. In any case, a country like Egypt didn't even start to speak Arabic in large amounts until about 900. And they started doing it just because it was financially better for you, right? Nobody was forcing them to speak Arabic. It was just, I'm in the Arab Empire. I need to be able to trade with Syria. So in other words, Arabic slowly became sort of what English is today. And that was true for the whole planet. People in India and China, for example, were learning Arabic just for trading purposes. And Arabic became the dominant language for trade. Egypt probably didn't even become majority Muslim until about 1300. And so, 700 years after it was conquered, it finally became majority Muslim. And the largest reason for that was the Crusades. in the aftermath of the Crusades, being a Christian became shockingly unpopular. Having said that, when the British did a census a little bit over 100 years ago in Egypt, they concluded that Egypt's population was still 25% Christian. So the Arab world has always been multi-religious. It's always been multi-ethnic. It was never something that was sort of forced on people. The Arabic language wasn't forced on people, and Islam wasn't forced on people. It became the dominant religion just through time, not through violence.
Let's fast forward back into, well, not the present, but 1925, 1930, where Sykes and Picot are drawing with their crayon on a handkerchief. So tell us more specifics about the borders they decided to create and why they did it in that way.
Okay, so there's a couple of things going on. One of them is oil. They know there's oil there, and the reason they know there's oil is because the English have been really fretting about this. So the English did have an oil company. It was Shell. Now, here's the really weird thing about Shell. Shell actually started off as an antique dealership and somehow slowly morphed into an oil company. Like, just the idea of it is so strange. The Dutch bought Shell. So the company became Royal Dutch Shell. And when that happened, the Dutch ended up with 51% of the company and the British ended up with 49%.
What year is this?
I can't tell you a year. I want to say it's like 1880s.
Okay.
Somewhere around there. And the British had already concluded that oil was the new coal. Like that was the future. You needed to have your own oil resources because at some point oil was going to replace coal. And you got to remember that the British Empire is a naval empire. Everything is based on ships. So if you're going to have oil-powered ships and you don't have access to oil, your empire's finished. So they're freaking out when Royal Dutch buys Shell. There was really only one other major oil corporation on the planet at the time, and it was Standard Oil, and that of course belonged to the United States. And so there were these two big oil companies, and the British didn't own either one of them. Now, having said that, the British had a great relationship with the Netherlands, and the British had a great relationship with the United States. So it wasn't like they were owned by two rival states. It wasn't like it was France and Germany that owned the oil companies. It's just that the British were concerned, what if something down the road changes or shifts? There's a bad election in the United States, or the Dutch decide they're more German and they want to go that direction. And so the British decide they have to have their own oil resource. So the way you looked for oil back then was you walked staring at the ground. And you were hoping to find like black shale or black sandstone, a porous rock that acts like a sponge, because if it's sitting on top of an oil field, it'll literally suck the oil into it and turn black. Or because there was so much oil on the planet at the time, you could literally step in a puddle of oil, and then that would be a big indication that there was oil. When the United States found oil in Pennsylvania, they found it at a place called Oil Creek. In other words, there was a really big hint there was probably oil there. And the reason the creek got named oil is the creek was cutting through the oil field, and then oil floats. So there was this sheen of oil on top of the creek. And they went, I bet there's oil here. Let's dig. So, that was how you found oil. Mostly you kept your eyes open. But the problem is the planet is huge. And so even though the British Empire owned a giant chunk of the planet, the idea of sending out armies of people to look at their feet and comb the whole planet to look for oil seemed daunting. So the British decided to do something really extraordinary: read history books and look for conversations about oil in the history books. And they found those conversations about oil in the Middle East. 1,000 years ago, the cities in the Middle East lit up their streets at night using oil, using petroleum. The Roman Empire had, in the 7th century and then again in the 8th century, were using flamethrowers, using petroleum to fight the Arabs. At one point, Arab armies carried around glass balls with a wick in it, and inside it was oil, and they would light them and throw them like little napalm hand grenades. Naphthaline, that was the name of the soldiers. So the British knew there was oil, they just didn't know where. And so they moved in, grabbed Kuwait. By this point, the British already had a presence in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, and that was in the United Arab Emirates. They created the Trucial Coast. They had already established a relationship with Oman. So grabbing Kuwait was just taking a chunk of land away from the Ottoman Empire and basically creating a base with the idea of looking for oil in southern Iraq or in Iran. They made a deal with the Persian government, and the deal was amazing. They got 86% concession. So normally when you make a deal like that, you get a 50-50, right? You're the British company, you're doing the work, but it's the Iranian oil, so they should get their share. 50-50 is pretty normal, but the Qajars, the rulers of Iran, were really, how should we say, into opium, and maybe not exactly high in the IQ range, eager to get that British opium more than they were eager to advance their country. And so the British got this really amazing concession from them. And that began to shape the way they thought about oil. I'm sorry, thought about the Middle East. Having said that, they found oil. I'm pretty sure the Anglo-Persian Oil Company found oil in like 1908. We should double check my date. So that shortly after they get the concession, they find it. Shortly after they find it in Iran, the Ottoman Empire finds it in what is today northern Iraq. And the British are eager to get a deal with the Ottoman Empire for that oil. But the Ottomans decide that Germany is their future. And so the Turks make a deal with the Germans. And of course, in that moment, the British are thinking, okay, the Ottoman Empire is, we have to destroy it. Germany can't have this oil. Germany can't have this kind of access to oil. And the reason is, quite simply, that they were worried that the German Navy was going to eventually eclipse the British Navy. And the British and the Germans were in an arms race. Every time the Germans built a ship, the British would build 2 ships. And that would force the Germans to build another ship to try to cancel the 2 ships the British just built, which would then force the British to build 2 new ships. And they were bankrupting each other. At the rate that they were building ships, it was inevitable that both economies were going to collapse. And that's one of the reasons why World War I had to happen. They had to just resolve the arms race one way or another. Somebody just simply had to come out on top. And of course, the British come out on top. There is nothing wrong or evil about what the Germans did any more than what the British or the French did in World War I. They're not the bad guys. They were all bad, right? It was just a bunch of evil states attacking each other. It's not like World War II where it's easy to sort of lay blame on the Germans. In any case, Sykes and Picot get together because they want to talk about what the future is, and that future will not include an Ottoman Empire. The British and the French had decided that they were simply going to take out the Ottoman Empire. It didn't hurt any that there's an Arab uprising, and the Arabs are actually in the act of defeating the Ottomans because they're trying to break away and create their own independent state. And so the British and the French, well, the British really, not the French, assist the Arab uprising, but not because they cared about Arab aspirations, but because an enemy of an enemy is a friend. And then their first goal, of course, was to undermine that Arab state, and they did. They successfully undermined it. That Arab state did exist briefly. Its capital was Damascus. It had a flag shockingly similar to the Jordanian and Palestinian flag. The stripes weren't the exact order, right? It wasn't black, white, green. It was, if I remember correctly, green, black, green, white, but almost the exact same flag. And that's where the Jordanians and the Palestinians got their flag. It was inspired by that first attempt at creating a united Arab state from Syria. In any case, Sykes and Picot, before that Arab state existed, before World War I is resolved, are sitting down and talking about how they're going to carve up the Middle East. When they made the plan, there was still a Russian Empire. So Greece, the Italian Empire, the Russian Empire, the British Empire, and the French Empire were going to be the participants in this giant carve-up event. So one piece that needed to be carved up was the Ottoman Empire. They were going to leave a piece behind that was going to become Turkey, but they were going to give a big piece to Italy in the south. So Antalya area, that was going to go to Italy. In the west, Izmir was going to go to Greece. So the Greeks were going to have the western shore of what is today Turkey. And then the French were going to end up with Syria, Lebanon, and what is today Iraq. The English were only going to take what is today Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. And the reason why the British were okay with that is then the French would get the oil that was in Iraq because the British were planning to get the oil that was in Iran. The Russian Empire was going to invade Iran, take the northern half of Iran, and the British Empire was going to invade and take the southern half, and that would get them access to oil that they could feel secure with. The Russians, though, during World War I, decide they're going to go communist, have the Bolshevik Revolution, and declare that they no longer have imperialist aspirations and that they won't work with capitalists anymore. And the British Empire realizes if there's no Russia to invade Iran from the north, there's no way the British can manage Iran by themselves. They need to divide and conquer. They can't do it just conquering. So the British backstab the French and take Iraq. And they're like, we're sorry, but we need to secure our oil fields. You guys just have to figure it out on your own.
Why do the French just agree to that?
The French were in such awful shape at the end of World War I. The British Empire was the hegemonic superpower. France was in the number 2 slot. I think that at that point, the French were just grateful that the British were willing to even cut them in because the French had nothing to do with the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. It was the Arab uprising. The British did do the invasion at Gallipoli, but that also didn't, right? The Turks won at Gallipoli. It's okay though, because the British were using Australians and nobody loves Australians. So, they're it's amazing that the British are like that, but they are. It's really amazing. In any case, I think the French were just happy to have anything at that point. They were grateful. Also, they will figure out eventually it's too late for them, but there is oil in northern Syria. It was nothing like what was in Iraq. So they were probably hoping that they'd find something.
Okay, and what happens with Egypt and Saudi Arabia?
Okay, so Egypt had a different trajectory. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invades Egypt. And after securing Egypt, he actually invaded Palestine. And his goal was to move the Jewish population out of France to Palestine. He wanted to ethnically cleanse the Jewish population from Europe. And, people see it as, oh, he loved the Jewish people. Well, if he loved them so much, why didn't he want them to stay in France? He clearly didn't love them as much as I think some people think. In any case, Napoleon is defeated. The British sink his navy. They catch his navy in a bay and sink it, and it's a disaster. And the French have to escape Egypt. And Napoleon was thinking he was going to basically march to China. He was going to start this new massive empire with Egypt as his base of operations, and the British ruin it for him. So he decides, okay, I'll just conquer Europe. So he retreats back to France. What that did, though, was it inspired somebody. So there was an Albanian general who was part of the Ottoman army. His name was Mehmet Ali or Muhammad Ali, depending on whether you're an Arab or a Turk. He was an Albanian, so I guess we should ask the Albanians what they say. He goes, wow, what Napoleon did was actually really cool. I bet I could do something like that myself. He takes his Ottoman army that he's in command of, he invades Crete, takes it over, and then waits for the Ottoman Empire to respond. It doesn't. And then he's like, well, let's go. And he invades Egypt, conquers Egypt, and then he takes his army into Palestine, goes up through Syria, and he actually invades what is today Turkey before the Ottoman Empire goes, whoa, what are you doing? Please stop. Right? He's just an Ottoman general who goes rogue. He didn't speak any Arabic. He knew Turkish and Albanian. His soldiers mostly speak Turkish and Albanian. Like this is such an odd thing to be doing, but this is what he does. He's a visionary and he thinks in grand terms. He negotiates out a deal with the Ottoman Empire where he'll give back a bunch of Syria and Turkey. In exchange, he'll become basically the governor of an autonomous Egypt. And he starts a whole dynasty of kings of Egypt they didn't take the title initially, but it's effectively what they became, who are going to be the governors of a semi-autonomous Egypt. And to mix the two histories, the Saudi family had actually created a state. So if you look it up, it's the first Saudi state in the 1700s. That Saudi state lasted something like 80 years. What happened was their capital was Diriyah, which is right next to Riyadh. In 1818, the Ottoman Empire was really upset with this first Saudi state because it had become quite large. It conquered what is today the UAE. It had Bahrain. It had essentially all of what is today Saudi Arabia. And that was at the expense to some degree of the Ottoman Empire. Not all of that land was Ottoman territory, but a bunch of it was. And so the Ottoman Empire asked Mehmed Ali basically for a favor. And they said, technically you're part of the empire. Can you go put down this Saudi state? And he does. He takes an army into the first Saudi state. He goes to Diriyah. He destroys Diriyah. And the first Saudi state is terminated. It doesn't stick. I think it was 6 years later, 1824. That's the year in my head. A second Saudi state is formed. That second Saudi state will eventually also fail. And then a third Saudi state is formed out of Najd. Its idea is it wants to recreate the first Saudi state, this big, almost the entire Arabian Peninsula size state. But when we were talking earlier, I was telling you about the fact that there was this attempt to create this Arab state in Syria. When that Arab state was being created, it was created by Hijazis. So people who were living in Western Saudi Arabia. It was a Hashemite kingdom. The British go to the Sauds and they say, we're going to undermine and destroy this Hashemite state, but it would be helpful if you did as well. Now, the Sauds don't react to that. They're not directly responsive to the British, but eventually they do. And they'll go and they'll conquer Hijaz. They'll put it together and they create the third Saudi state. As a result, the British and the Saudi royal family had a cordial relationship. The British saw the Sauds as somebody they could work with, somebody that maybe they had enough in common with, that they didn't feel like they were a threat. In the case of Egypt, the British did something really strange. So the French built the Suez Canal, but when the French built the Suez Canal, they charged Egypt for it. Now you go, okay, well, they built it. Well, let me rephrase that. A French company went to Egypt and then hired Egyptian laborers at way under labor value prices, and then had them almost as slaves dig the Suez Canal with high mortality rates, and then charged the Egyptian government for that. And at some level, you go, really? This is just another little imperialist scheme. Well, to do this, the Egyptian state had to borrow money from banks. So that's what they did. Well, in 1882, the British government decided that they were going to use the debt Egypt owed it as an excuse to invade. They invaded and conquered Egypt. There was actually a whole defense force set up in Alexandria to try and stop a possible European invasion. The defense force fails, and the British take over Egypt, and they make it a protectorate inside the empire, and they eventually force the Khedive out of power, but then they replace him with a king. And so Egypt becomes an independent kingdom from the Ottoman Empire at that point.
So let's move to 1950, right? But for the sake of actually working through this, let's just deal with the region as a region now. And I just want you to talk through how some of the events that occurred were just really interventionist and how destructive they were. Let's start with Syria in 1949.
Yeah, so Syria gets its independence from the French Empire right after World War II, 1946. And the first president of Syria is a guy named Al-Qawatli. It's a fledgling state. It's a republic. They're having free and fair elections. They're trying to make things work. And in the middle of this, there is a coup d'etat. The coup d'etat is launched by the CIA. There's a guy named Miles Copeland, who, by the way, was also a musician. So it's possible people have heard of him. He was a jazz musician. His son, I think, became the drummer for Sting. So there was like a little bit of a family thing. He was in the CIA. And he goes to Syria and launches this coup d'etat, and they topple the Qawatli government, and it's catastrophic. Syria will then end up spending years trying to dig itself out, 9 years, trying to dig itself out of this. If I remember correctly, Syria ended up with 11 governments over the course of that 9 years. Like, it was just coup after coup after coup. At one point, a guy who had been pulled out of government by a coup ends up doing a coup again and getting back in. Like, it's a mess. It's a disaster. Finally, in 1958, al-Qawatli gets back into power. He manages to get back a hold of the Syrian state. He examines it, he looks it over, and he concludes Syria has collapsed, that it's a failed state, and that there's really nothing he can do to stop it from truly becoming failed. And he went to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and said, "You want to unify the Arabs? Let's start right now. Unify with Syria." Nasser said, "This is a disaster. I'm not ready. Egypt's not ready. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the political system. We haven't built the institutions necessary to do this." And Qawatli goes, "Look, this is going to end two ways. A, Egypt annexes Syria and we become the United Arab Republic, or B, Syria goes communist. The communists are on the brink of taking over the state." And Nasser was a fierce anti-communist. He was a socialist, but he didn't have any use for communists. And so Nasser basically went, "Fine, I don't want Syria to go communist." And he annexes. And of course, that's a disaster. Nasser literally became paranoid. Abdel Hakim Amr was a terrible guy to have being in charge of this. He was a narcissist who only thought of himself. So the combination of Nasser's paranoia and Abdel Hakim Amr's incompetence, the Syrian military does a coup and pulls Syria out of the United Arab Republic after 3 years. It doesn't help much. Syria is still having coup d'etat after coup d'etat. Finally, in 1970, Hafez al-Assad takes over, and Hafez al-Assad had what it took to stabilize the Syrian state, and he will rule it until he dies, and then his son has been ruling since. Syria has not had the best post-World War II experience.
Take me back, just what were the motivations for the CIA coup back in 1949? Why did they do it?
So this is like, I have a better chance of telling you the motivations for Mossadegh's overthrow. At some level, I think it was an experiment to see if they could do a coup. And they were like, let's just pick a random country, go in there and take it down. And the reason I'm saying that is because Syria wasn't an oil-rich state. Syria's economy wasn't big enough to care about it one way or another. It wasn't like Syria was promoting some kind of ideology that the United States didn't like. Like there's no real good analysis, I think, that you could come up with a real motivation for doing it, other than we just want our guy to be in charge in another country. But the problem is they didn't get that result. They just got a series of coups that followed. So if that was their goal, they failed on a really grand scale. But, Qawatli was no threat to U.S. foreign policy. He wasn't, in a position to do anything serious against anybody or anything. So it doesn't it doesn't feel like it has the kind of logic that what happens in Iran has.
Okay, so what happens in Iran? Why does the CIA overthrow Mossadegh in 1953?
So in 1950, Mossadegh becomes the prime minister of Iran, and one of the things he wants to do is get rid of this stupid concession the British got when they created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. By this point, it's called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company because Persia has renamed itself Iran. Um, and so Mossadegh decides he's going to nationalize the oil company, and the British will have a 0% concession. And so the oil company today is called the National Iranian Oil Company. They just replaced Anglo with National. Mossadegh knows from past experience that the British will do a coup d'etat and overthrow his government if he attempts to do this. Iran would have just noticed what happened to al-Quwatli, so it's not like it's a far-fetched scenario. It just happened the year before, but Iran's experience with this was way more intimate. In 1905, Iran it began to experiment with becoming an electoral republic. And it actually implemented the institution and began to have elections. The British lost their mind. They were horrified at the prospect that if Iran did become a democratic society, that the voters would vote for a government that would come back later and vote to end the British concession, the British oil concession. So the British went to the Russians and said, look, let's get in there. Let's overthrow the government and basically restore the monarchy. And so that's what they did. And so the Mossadegh knows that the British will do this again to Iran's second attempt at becoming a democracy in the sense that we misuse the word today, right? It's really a republic. So the first thing he does before he nationalizes the oil company is he throws the British embassy out, because the British embassy is where they'll launch the coup from. And so he throws the British embassy out, basically cuts off relations with the English, and then he nationalizes the oil company. The British immediately go to Harry S. Truman and say, hey, Mr. President, we can't overthrow the Iranian government because our assets have been kicked out of the country, but you could, you want to use your cool little CIA and what you just did in Syria and do that in Iran. And Truman said, no, he didn't want to do it. And then, of course, in 1952, Eisenhower is running for president. The British don't even wait for him to win the election. Everybody knows he'll win, so it's not a surprise. But still, they don't even wait for him to become president. They go to him and they say, once you become president, will you overthrow the government in Iran for us? And Eisenhower says, yeah, of course. Now, when and without getting into the details of how Kermit Roosevelt pulls off the overthrow of Mossadegh's government, when they do this, the British are thinking, okay, it'll be back to the way it was. And Eisenhower has to actually explain to the British, no, we're replacing you. You can still come back into Iran, but Iran's now in our sphere. And so that's the birth of the strong U.S.-Iranian relationship that ends in catastrophe with the Islamic Revolution.
Tell us about that relationship. Just tell us how intertwined Iran became with the USA under the Shah.
Yeah, so the Shah was a big dreamer. First of all, it's worth pointing out that in World War II, the Shah's father was taken out by the British, and the British feared that the Shah's father was a little too sympathetic to the Nazis. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason the British were doing this was they just wanted they wanted to make sure nothing happened in Iran to upset their supply of oil. So what happened was they overthrow the father, but have a conversation with the son before that happens, just to make sure he's okay with it. He's thrilled because he gets to become Shah that much quicker. The father got sent to the Seychelles, where he'll spend the rest of his life. And so the Shah of Iran now is this monarch whose power wasn't quite as strong as I think the British had hoped, which is why in 1950, Iran becomes a republic and Mossadegh as the prime minister is running the show. So when the United States does the coup against Mossadegh, they don't replace him with their prime minister. They basically give the power back to the Shah. They destroy Iran's republican institutions and make it an absolute monarchy, basically. And that's not completely, but make it into a constitutional monarchy with way more power in the Shah's hand than I think the average person would assume the United States would want. And the relationship became really strong, in part because the Shah viewed the United States as the thing you wanted to become. That was the goal. He wanted to modernize Iran. By the way, his father did too, and his father had implemented amazing modernization programs. The Shah wanted to modernize Iran, but he did some things that were culturally a little off. He kept promoting ancient Iranian culture, and it wasn't quite sinking in with the Iranian public. I bet if he did it now, it would, but at the time it wasn't. People weren't connecting with it. I know the reason I'm suggesting that it would now is I know that a lot of Iranians from the diaspora love to watch those videos. They're wishing that they had the Shah. A lot of them are wishing they had the Shah back and that he was promoting ancient Iranian civilization. He did manage to do some modernization, but what Iranians began to feel was he was doing it at the expense of Iranian culture and who Iranians were. They were losing their identity. One of the nicknames that Iran got was the shopping mall of the Middle East. And I think that rubbed a lot of people wrong. Gagouche, the famous singer, she's amazing, by the way. I love her stuff. She put out an album in the 1970s where she's holding two pistols and she's wearing a cowboy hat. And, Iran got into this culture of everybody's dyeing their hair and getting nose jobs so that they can have white-looking noses. And I think when you do something like that, you need to watch out for pendulum swing. In other words, Iran had gone too far in one direction too quickly, and that creates this reaction. And the reaction, of course, is this catastrophic event called the Islamic Revolution. It's a reactionary event because it's not addressing the core problems. It's just saying, we're going to zero everything out and start over again. And it doesn't work, I think, the way the average Iranian had hoped it would work.
Okay, we're gonna come back to the Iranian Revolution and the U.S. role in actually getting Khomeini to Iran. But before that, while we're still sort of in the 50s timeline, let's go back to Egypt and to Saudi Arabia, where two things are happening: where Nasser is trying to form the United Arab Republic, and where the Saudis are now in a decade relationship with the U.S. Post the Roosevelt deal. Can you tell us about the Roosevelt deal in 1945 and just how that started fomenting Saudi-U.S. relations?
We began to think there was probably some decent oil reserves in Saudi in the 1930s, and a Texas-California oil company called Caltex actually moved to Saudi and began looking for oil. And they began finding oil. So we knew there was something there. And as they kept exploring, they kept finding more and more. In World War II, in a last-ditch desperate attempt to try to turn the tide, the Germans launched an event called the Battle of the Bulge. So it's December 1944. The Germans surrender in May. So it's literally 6 months before they surrender. It's way too late to turn the tide, but that's the cool thing about fanatics. Fanatics don't care about it. They don't look at the data. They just act like maniacs. So here's what the Germans did. They took if you ask the average person on the planet today who won World War II, Germany, the United States, or the Soviet Union, I think you'd get three different answers from a large portion of the population. But the majority of people would say United States. It was the Soviet Union in Europe. The United States was a sideshow. The Germans had very few soldiers fighting the United States and France, and then on the Western Front, they had the worst equipment, their worst tanks, their worst artillery pieces. The Germans were fighting the Soviet Union. They had all their best units, all their best tanks fighting the Soviet Union. So they did a little bit of math, and they went, what if we weren't fighting the Soviet Union? Would we be able to defeat the United States and Great Britain? So they grabbed all their best units off the Eastern Front, left just a skeleton force on the Eastern Front, and rushed it to the Western Front, and they attacked through Belgium. And their goal was to get to the English Channel, cut off the British and US forces in the Netherlands, destroy them, and then sue for peace with the United States and Great Britain. And they thought that the United States and Great Britain would accept a German surrender where Germany would then be allowed to continue to fight the war against the Soviet Union, and maybe even that the United States and Great Britain would join Germany and help them fight the Soviet Union. That's how crazy this plan was. They attack, and it's like a hot knife through butter. American forces in Belgium are almost completely annihilated. There's an airborne unit in Bastogne that holds its ground and gets surrounded because the Germans just go all the way around it. Everything else disintegrates. The German military is on its way to the English Channel. There is nothing we can do to stop it. It is gonna happen. And then they ran out of gasoline. The Germans had the best tanks in the war at that point. They had Panthers and Tiger IIs. Nothing could stand up to it. The United States had crappy M4 Shermans. They were terrible tanks. And they ran out of gas. Tanks, I don't care how good your tank is. If it doesn't have gasoline, it's completely worthless. It's useless. We win the Battle of the Bulge and decide we never want to be that guy. We don't ever want to be in a situation where we're on the verge of possibly winning a battle and we lose it because we ran out of gasoline. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt goes to Egypt. He meets with the King of Saudi Arabia in the Suez Canal in January 1945, like literally the next month. And they make a deal, and the deal is to create Aramco, and the Saudis will agree to trade oil in US dollars. There will be a US airbase in Tehran. Aramco will be a joint Arabian-American oil company. The most important part is that Saudi Arabia promises it will never cut off the supply of oil to the United States. And then in return, the United States will protect the Saudi royal family for all eternity. So that's the deal.
Why do the Saudis trust the deal? I mean, over the last 60, 70 years, given America's interventions in various countries, which we'll still get to.
I mean, I would never trust the United States. How many allies has the United States ultimately ended up backstabbing or betraying or turning against? I think the thought that the Saudis have, and they're not wrong for this, is as long as the oil is flowing and as long as American businesses are making money, the United States has no incentive to disrupt the flow of oil by doing a war. So I think there's sort of a calculation there. And then eventually the Saudis realize something else, and that is they have so much capital that they can heavily invest in the United States, that the United States can end up with a kind of a codependent relationship with Saudi Arabia. So, and they were right to think that. The United States obviously has a more codependent relationship with China and Japan, but the Saudis are, in the mix. And so I think at some level, the Saudis were gambling on, we'll just make it economically not useful for the United States to mess with them. And they got lucky. And Saudi Arabia is an amazing place today because they got lucky. They could have very easily have been on the wrong side of it, and they just weren't.
So, I mean, we've discussed Nasser quite a bit, but I think it's important to just kind of speak more about him and his vision, and how his vision is more or less eventually cut down by the events of the 1967 war.
Yeah, so Nasser's goal was to create a united Arab Republic. The idea of it came out of the 1919 uprising in Medan Tahrir, place that Egyptians love to do revolutions. This idea of pan-Arab secular socialist state comes into being. The revolution started there was a revolution in 1880, the English attack in 1882. In the middle of the revolution, they used the revolution as a way to sort of use Egypt's instability to take it over. 1919, Egypt does another revolution. And then in 1952, Egypt does a third revolution. Egyptians like revolutions. In case you hadn't figured it out. 2011, he does yet another revolution. It's like a hobby. It's a side gig. Um, I think only Iran has had more uprisings than Egypt in the last 100 years. So um, Iran and Egypt are clearly in a competition. In any case, in 1952, the army steps in and they overthrow the monarchy and they end the revolution. When that happens, Mohamed Najib becomes the first president of Egypt. For the record, he was half Sudanese, so sometimes you'll hear Egyptians say, we had the first black president of a white country. Uh, if Egyptians got on an airplane and flew to the United States and got off the airplane, no Americans would identify them as white. It's maybe you could maybe make the argument he's the first black president of a brown country, but it's fun, this idea of aspiring to whiteness that people do. In any case, Mohamed Najib ends up getting compromised by the CIA. The CIA actually brought in bags of money to bribe him. Nasser finds out about it and basically does a coup and takes over the country. Nasser was already probably pulling strings in the background. It wasn't like he came out of nowhere. He takes over the country and then he has a new constitution created and they actually have a vote for it. So Nasser's thinking was, let's move towards this pan-Arab state. Let's do it slowly. Let's build the institutions that are necessary. And he takes some gambles. So one of the gambles that he makes, by the way, King Farouk had already committed to doing this, was to educate the Egyptian population. So in other words, put a bunch of money into making it so that there was an elite, educated Arab class of people who could build bridges, who could build roads, build buildings. They would be the lawyers to run the state. They could build dams or at least maintain them, right? He wanted to create this technocrat and skilled population, bunch of MDs, so that Egypt would be able to become a fully modern state. We've already talked about what happens with Syria, and obviously that does a lot to derail Nasser's goals because, in part, he needed Syria to work, and it doesn't work. What also happens right around the same time period is Yemen ends up in a civil war. And the monarchy is being attacked by socialists. The socialists ask Egypt to come in, and Yemen becomes a republic. And the monarchists become a rebel force that are trying to defeat the republic and restore the monarchy. And the Egyptians do go in 1961. Yemen actually joins what was called the United Arab States, because Nasser's original goal was to create a confederacy. So there would be a United Arab States, and then eventually that would morph into a single state, which would be called the United Arab Republic. So when Syria and Egypt join, they're derailing his timeline. But Yemen does join the United Arab States. It's why Yemen has the flag that it has. By the way, Iraq had planned to join the United Arab Republic. That's why it has the flag it has. So in other words, Palestine and Jordan have the Hashemite Damascus Kingdom of Syria state flag, and then Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Sudan, and Yemen have variants of the United Arab Republic flag. In any case, the Egyptian army is bogged down in Yemen. Nasser's reforms tended to be idealistic. They weren't necessarily always well thought through. They definitely weren't always executed very well. The army started to get a little corrupt because people began to realize they could make money from within. In other words, his dream is kind of falling apart while he's alive, but he's also contending with a new force in the world, which is describable as Islamic fundamentalism. So there's a point where he makes a speech and he talks about an event that he had with the head of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And the speech is really a fascinating speech. It's a cultural speech, right? I want to say he's making the speech around 1958, 1960. I don't know the exact year, but it's early in his presidency. And he said, when we first did the revolution, we met with the Brotherhood because we wanted to come up with a compromise so that we didn't have to think about any kind of struggle going forward. We'd have a unified Egypt. And he said, okay, what is the one thing you want to see? And the Brotherhood leader said, I want women to cover their hair. And Nasser goes, that's the thing you wanted to see? Like, that's the change that will make Egypt a better place, is women are covering their hair? And he says, yeah. And Nasser says to him, no, in your house, you make the rules. But I think people should be free to do whatever they want to outside of the home, right? You want to cover your hair, you don't. And the guy's like, no, you're the president of Egypt. You have to set the moral standard. So Nasser tells him, he says, well, I checked up your daughter. She's in medical school and her hair isn't covered. You can't cover your daughter's hair. You want me to go cover the hair of 10 million Egyptian women? There's a crowd. Nasser's giving this speech to a live crowd. They erupt with laughter because just 65 years ago, the idea that Egyptian women were going to cover their hair was a laughable thing. In other words, there wasn't this kind of fundamentalist Muslim movement yet. It was forming with the Brotherhood. The idea of it was there. It hadn't really gripped the Middle East yet. And Nasser is having to deal with that. He's dealing with Yemen. He's got a government that's slowly becoming more and more corrupt. Some of his plans aren't totally well thought through. Syria breaks away. The Sudan breaks away. And then comes 1967. The Israelis begin doing raids in Jordan. So the King Hussein of Jordan is telling Nasser, you have to do something to help us. The Israelis keep attacking us. And Nasser is in a position where he feels like if he doesn't do something, that he'll look foolish. So he closes the Straits of Tiran. So if you look at a map, there's the Gulf of Aqaba is a very thin body of water between Saudi Arabia and the Sinai. Jordan and Israel touch the Gulf of Aqaba. Israel has a tiny little city there called Eilat, and it got something like maybe 2%, maybe 5% of its trade through Eilat. It was Red Sea trade. When Nasser closes the Straits of Jordan, he's closing somewhere between 2 to 5% of Israel's trade. But he doesn't actually close it. He declares it closed and then doesn't enforce it. So it's a completely symbolic gesture. And the reason he's doing it is he feels backed into a corner and feels he has to do something. So he doesn't enforce it. So Israeli ships could just freely go through it. And then what ends up happening is Israel says, you cut off the lifeblood of Israel. We can't function like this. And they begin to rattle their saber, like, we're going to go to war. Nasser actually sends a communique to President Lyndon Baines Johnson and says, I want to resolve this peacefully. The Israelis sound like they're going to probably attack Egypt at some point. Where are we on this? And Johnson says, don't worry about it. I promise you Israel will not attack. And Nasser needs to know, because so much of the military is in Yemen and the Israelis do attack. They completely surprise the Jordanian, Syrian, and Egyptian militaries, and they defeat all three simultaneously in a blitzkrieg-style war reminiscent of German tactics in World War II. They do it in 6 days. So if you really hate an Egyptian and you just want to hurt them, just go 1967. It is simply one of the most humiliating events ever. And it's catastrophic. At that point, Nasser has lost all sorts of legitimacy. Egypt loses the Sinai, the Suez Canal, which he had, politically managed to keep and hold, is now shut down because the Israelis are on the other side of the Suez Canal, cutting off European and Asian trade. They now have to go all the way around Africa. The Israelis seize the Golan Heights, they seize the Gaza Strip, they seize the West Bank. And so now all of a sudden the Palestinian population, which had been, the West Bank was in Jordan, the Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt, that that Palestinian population is now under total Israeli control, except for the refugees in Syria or the refugees in Jordan or Egypt. And so it's a shocking, game-changing event. Nasser walks into Maidan Tahrir and he says, "I don't deserve to be your president. I'm ready to resign." And the people start shouting his name and they lift him into the air and they say, "You're our president." And he remains the president of Egypt for 3 years until he dies. But those are, 3 relatively unproductive years. In effect, what happened was he went up against the United States and he didn't quite pull it off. That there's a lot of lessons in what went wrong, and he's worth examining, and it's hard to be mad at him, but he does in the end ultimately fail.
You mentioned that he goes up against the United States. Do you think the United States was privy to Israel's attack? What's your reading of that?
So it's hard to say. The United States had a ship off the coast of the Sinai called the USS Liberty, and the Israelis actually attacked the U.S. ship and destroyed it. They sank it. When the U.S. sailors were getting off the ship into lifeboats, the Israelis actually went in with an airplane and strafed it and was shooting the sailors in the water. At one point, Israeli boat came and grabbed one of the lifeboats and lifted it in the air to knock the sailors into the water. And that event has always struck me as really bizarre. It almost makes me feel like there was a disagreement about whether Israel should attack or not. And this was a way Israel was showing the United States, no, we're going to do whatever we want to. We don't even care about you and your ships. But it's also possible that it was the other way, that Johnson knew all along and he was happy to let the Israelis do what they did. And you never know what to do with eyewitness accounts, but there were eyewitness accounts in Egypt of U.S. aircraft flying over Egypt during the war, attacking Egyptian sites, airfields, attacking Egyptian airfields. I don't know that there's enough evidence of that to say that the United States did it. The United States did have an aircraft carrier in the area, so it's possible. But whether or not the United States was behind it or backed it is unclear. It's a little shrouded in mystery. If I was going to guess, I would say the United States was totally okay with it, probably knew, and was happy with the outcome.
We haven't yet actually discussed the origins of Israel and Palestine. So I think before we move, because we're about to jump back to Persia and Iran and the Shah and the revolution, and then the Iran-Iraq war, and then Gulf War I. But I think before that, let's go back. Let's deal with probably what we're gonna what's the main reason for our discussion today. Let's discuss the genesis of Israel.
Yeah. So in the aftermath of World War II, the Zionist movement finally had a little bit of legitimacy. So Zionism was born in the end of the 19th century as a result of the Dreyfus Affair. So Dreyfus was a Jewish German officer in the French army. It's a little convoluted. He gets busted by the French for being a spy for Germany. The Jewish population in Europe interpreted that as an attack on a Jewish person. It's just as possible, if not as likely, that it was actually an attack on an ethnic German living in France, right? Yeah, there was probably, I'm not denying that there was anti-Semitism in France, and there obviously was, but he was also German, so there was probably also a component of anti-Germanness. The reality was he was scapegoated. He had nothing to do with what he was being charged with. And so Zionists like Herzl are born, the Zionist movement is born, Herzl kind of being the father of it, in the Jewish population. It already existed as an idea. We described earlier Napoleon wanting to send Jews to Palestine. So the dominant anti-Jewish ideology was originally called Judenhass in Germany, which meant Jew hatred. The problem with the name was it sounds like an emotional thing as opposed to a logical thing. So they coined the phrase anti-Semitism so that they could say, look, it's not that I have an emotion. I disagree with the presence of Jews in Europe. A component of the anti-Semitic movement was we just wanted the Jews to leave. The initial ideology didn't want to kill the Jewish population. Obviously, it morphs into that and turns into the Holocaust. But the original goal wasn't to kill them; it was just to evict them. In the same way that there's a portion of the United States population that wants to evict undocumented immigrants, or that the German population wanted to evict undocumented Polish immigrants, or that the British wanted to evict the Polish immigrants, and that's why they voted for Brexit, right? It's that mentality. And so here are these profoundly racist anti-Semites. They coined the phrase anti-Semitism. The Zionist movement goes, maybe they're right. Maybe we should leave Europe. Maybe we can't make a good life for ourselves here. Herzl wasn't interested initially in Palestine. He was thinking someplace like Uganda. So in a really weird way, what happened was the creation of a population of white Europeans who wanted to conduct a colonial enterprise, not unlike the colonial enterprise that ended up with Argentina and the United States and Canada and Australia, where there would be a population of white people going to another country and ethnically cleansing and genociding the local population to take it from them. Ultimately, the Zionists really just wanted to go to Palestine. The Balfour Declaration sort of reinforces the idea of going to Palestine. Balfour was a British lord who said that's where they should end up. And then World War II happens. Before World War II happens, a lot of Jews decide to do this, and they begin migrating to Palestine. The Palestinian population welcomed them. They saw this as sort of a natural outcome. In part because historically Jews and Muslims and Christians in the Middle East got along. I mean, you have to remember that even during the Crusades, the native Christian population, if it had been open to the Crusader states in the beginning, totally rejected the Crusader states by the end and were siding with their fellow Muslims against the Crusaders, and the Jewish population was always against the Crusaders. There was this history of Muslims knew the Jews were their allies. And so the idea of Jewish Europeans coming to Palestine, the Palestinians welcomed them in. There's account after account after account of Palestinian families letting like Jewish Poles move into their homes and live with them. And then they would do something foolish, like go on vacation and come back. And the Jewish population in the home said, no, this is our home now. And you can't come back into it. And so there was this strange effect of the Palestinians going, yeah, sure, come. The Jewish immigrants to Palestine.
Sorry, this was like 1910, 20s, like
10s, 20s, 30s. Some of them began to do terrorism. And so there were terrorist organizations formed. They began attacking British assets. They attack hotels, British military bases. So there's a violent element to this. There was also an attempt to simply legally purchase land, and the Zionists ended up purchasing somewhere around 5-10% of Palestine legally. And then in the process, there was attempts to create land confiscation, where they would just go onto a piece of land that nobody owned and begin colonizing it. The World War II happens. There's the Holocaust, which is a catastrophic event, and the world becomes open to the idea that, yeah, there needs to be a Jewish state. The irony is if you're going to create the Jewish state, let's do it. So I'm part Austrian. I want to out that because I'm going to suggest the Middle East peace solution. Let's make Austria a new Israel. Hitler was an Austrian. The Germans, Austria is German. They speak German. You can talk to Austrians and go, I'm not German, I'm Austrian, whatever. They're Germans. Germany did the Holocaust. Germany annexed Austria and did the Holocaust. So put Israel in Austria, call it Israel, make the Danube be the boundary between the Austrian area. So instead of calling it the West Bank, you call it the North Bank, right? And put the Austrians there. Vienna will rename it Jerusalem. And then Tyrol will call it the Tyrol Strip. And we'll just shove a bunch of the Austrian population into the North Bank and the Tyrol Strip. But then let's colonize the North Bank and create little walled off sections and ghettoize the. I mean, I think that's the solution, the natural solution. Instead, the world thought, let's do this to Palestine, which is ironic because the Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust in any way, shape, or form. Uh, During the war, some Jews from Palestine actually joined a Jewish brigade that fought with the British. The British wouldn't let Palestinians do that because they didn't want Palestinians to have had combat experience. But they did employ Palestinians as stevedores. So Palestinians did serve on the docks, loading and unloading ships, so that white people could fight the war because the British were nervous about having brown and black people fight. They did. Brown and black people definitely fought for the British. They were just reluctant. They didn't want anybody getting an idea and leading a rebellion when they went back home to Kenya or South Africa or Palestine. Ironically, the British love to put Gurkhas and Maoris into combat situations, but that's a different story. So in the aftermath of all of this, the UN votes to divide Palestine and create an Israel and a Palestine. The vote for the division gave Israel about 55% of Palestine and gave the Palestinians 45%. So the 55% that was going to go to Israel, that land was to create a Jewish-only state. And then the 45% that was going to go to Palestine would be for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But the problem is that the land didn't belong to the Jewish population, right? Because they bought 5 to 10% of the land. So basically, you're gifting somewhere between 45 and 50% of the land to this Zionist movement. Well, what about the Palestinians already living there? So the Arabs rejected this. The Israelis invaded. They declare their independence. What it is it's a colonial enterprise. They invade and conquer Palestine. There's a war, the 1948 war, and the Egyptian army goes in with rifles that don't work. They had tanks that were profoundly flawed, like tanks that could only turn in one direction, or the turret didn't turn, or the machine gun didn't work. They were mostly, I don't know if they were mostly, but a lot of them were Stuarts, which were these little itty bitty tankettes. The Israelis were better armed, better equipped. They had more combat experience. There was a bunch of them. There was a huge invasion force. The Jordanians made an attempt to stop this. The Syrians fought. There were Iraqi units that showed up as volunteers. Nobody could stop the Israelis from creating the state. By the time they were done, the Israelis ended up with 78% of Palestine. So the UN division of Palestine created 3 Israeli wedges, one in the middle, one in the northeast, and then one in the south. And then it created 4 Palestinian wedges, one that was about twice the size of the Gaza Strip, where the Gaza Strip is like the remnant of it, one that was probably about 1 1/3 times the size of the West Bank, where the West Bank is, and then one in the northwest. So, like Bethlehem was supposed to be in the West Bank, and then Haifa was supposed to be Palestinian. And by the time the Israelis were done, they had shrunk the West Bank, they had dramatically shrunk the Gaza Strip, and they just took the remaining piece. There were 4 pieces because Jaffa was going to become a little enclave in Palestine that was completely surrounded by Israel and the sea. And then Jerusalem was going to be a neutral zone, and it was going to be administered by the United Nations. That was the plan. And the Israelis, of course, broke the whole thing. Old Jerusalem or East Jerusalem ended up in Jordan. West Jerusalem ended up in Israel. And the Israelis, during the conquest, committed some acts of terrorism. So there's a place called Deir Yassin where they conduct a massacre. And the hope was to cause panic in the Palestinian population, to cause them to run away. And they did. A huge portion of the Palestinian population flees, fearing that Deir Yassin was just the beginning of a series of massacres. One of the catastrophic ironies of all of this is Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial, is across the valley from Deir Yassin. So it's almost like there's the commemoration of a terrible, cruel injustice across the valley from a terrible, cruel injustice. Instead of the world creating more justice, it heaped more suffering on a population of people that had nothing to do with the initial suffering.
Okay, so now I'm just gonna we are gonna now start discussing Iran, but I just want to sort of remind our viewers just where we are, right? So we're about to move to the Iranian Revolution and why that occurred, but by now, in 1979, Sadat is in charge. Well, he's just been assassinated, but or about to be assassinated, right? Timeline wise.
Yeah, he's about to be assassinated.
He's about to be assassinated, right? And Mubarak is about to be in charge there. Hafiz al-Assad is in charge of Syria. The Saudi family is in charge of Saudi Arabia and have a nice and cozy relationship with the U.S. based on the U.S. taking most of their oil for protection. Saddam is now in charge of Iraq. We haven't really dealt with Iraq yet, but I guess we can deal with that as we start speaking about the Iran-Iraq war. And the Shah is increasingly becoming more and more unpopular in Iran. Why was he unpopular?
It's in large measure a backlash against the Americanization of Iran. So if you talk to an Iranian, I don't care who they are, all Iranians are profoundly proud of being Iranian. Iranian nationalism is a real and powerful force. And I think Iranians felt under the Shah that he was too authoritarian. They wanted a republic. They had tried twice before. They had lost that opportunity. They saw him as the United States as lackey. They saw their own culture being eroded. And then you got this pendulum swing event where instead of addressing those problems, you get the reaction of the Iranian Revolution. There were two factions in the revolution, the communists and the Muslim fundamentalists. And the United States made a cold calculation. And the cold calculation was simply this: if the communists win, Iran is going to go to the Soviet sphere, and it'll help them in the Cold War. And it'll give them direct access to the Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and possibly oil. And the United States felt that that would be a catastrophic outcome. And so at that point, then the United States went for backing the Islamists to prevent the communists from taking over. And so the Iranian Revolution takes place. The fundamentalists win. They literally murder the communists. A lot of the communists end up fleeing and going in this direction and that direction. So instead of it creating a republic that has the possibility of other parties competing, it becomes a republic where only people who are okayed by the Islamic Republic get to run and for office. And so it didn't become the republic I think the average Iranian was hoping it would become. For the record, early on, there was a protest where women took to the streets and they were basically protesting to defend women's rights. And the state kind of made it clear that this was not going to be tolerated. And so there's this cold, kind of scary moment, this kind of Gilead moment, to invoke a Handmaid's Tale, where the women are thinking, we're going to be okay. And they take to the streets and the state is like, oh, no, don't worry about it. You're not going to be okay. This is going to go in a very specific direction. And so instead of, a moderating force that's creating a republic and trying to, overthrow the monarchy and maybe bring Iran into the future, it's this reactionary force that wants to bring Iran into the past, an imaginary past, because Iran never had a state like it does now. There's no medieval or ancient state that looks like this. This is completely 100% a modern state in every way, shape, and form. But it's a modern state that pretends that there was some glorious past that you can get to, which is, by the way, a core doctrine of all right-wing movements, right? That there was an imaginary moment somewhere in the past where people were living correctly, they were doing the right thing, they were maybe a little bit less sinful and maybe a little bit more righteous. And there was never such a time. No time like that ever existed in the human experience. And so whenever right wingers come up with this imaginary past, what they're doing is they're concocting their vision for what they want the future to be, but it's a fully modern idea. For the Nazis, it was to recreate 1000 AD. For the fascists in Italy under Mussolini, it was to bring back the Roman Empire. And so we've seen these kinds of right-wing movements time and time again. They just sort of manifest themselves in different ways. Right now, we're seeing it with the Hindutva movement in India and Modi. We're seeing it in Hungary with his Christian fanatic movement and Orban, right? The Poles were experimenting with this, but at least for the time being, the Kaczynski brothers are out of power and Donald Tusk is in power. So this isn't unique to Iran in any way, shape, or form. It's a particularly rough form of it. But that's the outcome.
Okay, two things. I just want to let's move into the Iran-Iraq War and just the history of how Saddam is by now a U.S. ally in 1980, just before the war starts. But also just a few comments from you on in addition to the Shah just sort of looking towards the West and trying to impose a fake identity on Iranians. Just a discussion about his brutality.
Yeah. So in the grand scheme of things, his brutality pales compared to the current regime. But he was definitely authoritarian. If you stood up to him, you definitely had the possibility of going to prison. Plenty of people were in exile. There was some torture. There was some death. In other words, he wasn't a dreamy Scandinavian ruler. This wasn't this. Iran under the Shah was definitely not Sweden. But compared to what Iran is now, it was definitely probably a lot lighter form. I think people don't realize that at the end of the day, there's always this kind of continuum. There's a scale. When people talk about Nasser, they'll go, "Yeah, he oppressed people." He did. There is something like 1,700 cases of political repression under Nasser. Under Sadat, there was probably 30,000 cases of political repression. 1,700, 30,000. Sadat takes the prize, right? Nobody is a saint if they're the ruler of a state. States have to be brutal at some point in time. The question is, was there any excessive brutality in operating the state? And, in the case of the Shah, I think you can make the argument that he definitely crossed some lines. He definitely did not. This was not a free society by any means. But it's important to always kind of remember that there's this hierarchy of cruelty, and he's not at the top by any means.
Okay, so now the origins of the Iran-Iraq War and the impact it has.
So Saddam Hussein comes into power because Iraq, like Syria, ends up plunging into a few years of chaos. So it has a revolution in 58. Qasim becomes the prime minister of Iraq. Qasim is the guy who's like, I'm not sure I want Iraq to join the United Arab Republic, but I would like Iraq to join the Arab Republic. He's running this really strange line, and it's in part because his Soviet and CIA friends are telling him, please don't join, we'll support you if you don't. In 1963, 5 years after coming into power, the CIA kills him. So be careful who your friend is. If you get no other lesson from this, pick your friends carefully. So Qasim is murdered and Iraq plunges into chaos. It's like Syria. There's coup after coup after coup after coup. Finally, by the mid-1970s, Iraq has a relatively stable government. Saddam Hussein is the number 2 guy. The leader of Iraq is kind of senile and out of it, and Saddam Hussein becomes the de facto ruler. In 1978, the CIA hands him a list of Iraqis that the CIA doesn't like. The number in my head is 800, but we should double check that number. And they don't know what he's going to do with the list. They didn't give him instruction. What he did was he had them mass arrested, tried, like 30 people at a time in the same trial. They're found guilty, and a bunch of them are hanged live on TV. And the CIA goes, wow, man, that is our guy. You know what I mean? Like, we gave him a list. We didn't tell him what to do with it. He went full creative. He's like an artist. And so at that point, we've now established that he's going to work with us. He's definitely our guy. He becomes the ruler of Iraq, and Reagan gets into power. So Reagan gets into power in the same way, by the way, that Nixon does. He gets outside interference from a foreign state. I wonder if there's anybody else who's ever done that, let's say recently. Anyway, it's something to think about. So what happened with Nixon was he went to President Thieu of South Vietnam as they're wrapping up the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords were going to end the Vietnam War in November of 1968. So Saigon falls in 1975. So this is 7 years before the Vietnam War ends. They were about to end the Vietnam War. And Nixon basically goes to President Thieu and says, I will give you money directly. I will support you. I will give you weapons if you pull out of the peace talks. Because Nixon knew that if Thieu stayed in the peace talks, he couldn't win the election. Thieu takes the bribes, pulls out of the peace talks, Nixon wins the election. Reagan rips a page out of that playbook, and he does the same thing. So when the revolution happens in Iran, a group of students storm the US embassy, college students, because they want the documents that prove that the CIA overthrew the Mossadegh government. This is an international incident. It's a disaster for the Islamic Republic. They don't want to deal with this. They begin negotiating with the students to release their hostages because they captured somewhere around 50 CIA operatives. Everybody else had left the embassy. The CIA operatives were shredding the documents because they don't want the world to see all the stuff that they've been doing, because Tehran was the headquarters for CIA operations in Asia. So if the CIA did something ugly in China or the Philippines or in Indonesia, they had it documented in Tehran. So their job is to shred the documents. They know they're going to get captured because the Iranian government called them up and said, get out, and they can't because they have to finish. The students capture the embassy. They take the documents that have been shredded, stuff them into garbage bags, go to nearby schools, dump them out, and tell the kids, you love puzzles, right? And the kids put the documents back together. So now they have, in the United States' writing, documents that categorically prove not only that the United States overthrew their government in 1953, but how Kermit Roosevelt did it, and whom Kermit Roosevelt talked to, and where he was getting his money from. And in the mind of those students, the United States should now come clean and apologize, and they won't. And so the students said, we're not going to release the CIA operatives until you do. Rafsanjani, who will later become Prime Minister of Iran, Rafsanjani was a top cleric in the revolution. He starts negotiating with the students to get them to release the hostages. Right as it becomes clear he's got a deal, people from the Reagan campaign show up in Iran, and they just give him suitcases full of money, and they tell him, please don't let the students out, because they're worried that if the students get out before the election, Carter will win. And so they don't. Naively, Carter doesn't know that this has happened, and he works up until noon on the day Reagan is inaugurated to get the release of the hostages. And of course, that's what happens. The hostages are released because that was the deal that Reagan and his campaign had made with Rafsanjani. So now Reagan is president. He basically looks at Saddam Hussein and says, we want to hurt Iran. We want to hurt the Islamic Republic. And now, if you stop and you rationally think this through, what would be the purpose? Iran could be a useful trading partner for the United States. It's strategically located. So A, you're mad because you hate Muslim fundamentalists. Okay, maybe. B, you're worried that Iran will end up a Soviet out. Wait, no, then you would want to build relations with them if you're worried about that. You don't isolate them. So that can't be it. So, what are you left with? I mean, one of the things that I think is clear is the United States felt like we were in a relationship, we got jilted, and we want vengeance. And we talk Iraq into attacking Iran. The argument is that the southwest corner of Iran, Khuzestan, and actually the coast all the way to Bandar Abbas, is majority Arab. And it's an Arab-speaking region in Iran. And so the argument is that should be in an Arab state. So Iraq should capture it, annex it to Iraq. And Saddam Hussein goes along for the ride on faulty US intelligence. The US tells Iraq that the Islamic Republic has killed so many of its generals and colonels that the Iranian military will disintegrate. And it obviously doesn't. And this turns into a catastrophic 8-year-long war that kills at a minimum 1 million people, 750,000 Iranians and 250,000 Iraqis. The high number I've seen is double that number. Nothing is gained from the war other than just death, carnage, and the destruction, economic destruction of both states.
How then do we end up with the Gulf War I and the brutal sanctions which are posed on Iraq afterwards?
So we got a naughty GCC state doing something they shouldn't have been doing. So in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, it's 1989, Iran and Iraq both go to the OPEC states and say, look, we're dying over here. We need to get back on our feet. Is there any way you can help us out? And the answer was, and Saudi Arabia was at the center of this, what we'll do is every OPEC state will cut their production, and then Iran and Iraq can increase their production by that amount so that the supply of oil in the marketplace stays the same, so the price doesn't change. But it gives Iran and Iraq a larger share of the oil market. That way, they can use that extra revenue to repair and recover from the Iran-Iraq war. So everybody's happy. Kuwait began flooding the marketplace with oil, which caused the price of oil to plunge, which meant that any break that Iran and Iraq had gotten from their increased sales was evaporated. Saddam Hussein accused Kuwait of doing this. He brought in a UN team to examine this, and the UN team discovered that what Kuwait was doing was literally stealing Iraqi oil by both, there were oil fields on the border, they were pumping oil at an excessive amount on those oil fields, and they were slant drilling into Iraqi fields that were entirely on the Iraqi side of the border, and then flooding the market with Iraq's stolen oil, causing the price to collapse. Saddam Hussein brought in April Glaspie, the US ambassador to Iraq, and said, I've tried everything. The UN, I brought the UN in, the Kuwaitis won't stop doing this, I'm going to attack. And he basically told her, look, we have a historical claim to Kuwait. Kuwait was carved out of the Basra province of the Ottoman Empire, and we want to attack it and annex it. And she said, what happens between Arab states is of no concern to the United States. And so he interpreted that as a green light. He attacks. George Bush Sr. initially says, I don't see any issue with this at this moment, but I'm going to consult my team. He flies to Aspen. Margaret Thatcher flies to Aspen. They come out of the Aspen meeting, and George Bush Sr. goes, he's a Hitler. He's a Hitler. 1,000 points of light. And the next thing you know, we're doing Operation Desert Shield. And then the next thing you know, we're doing Operation Desert Storm. So to be clear, invading Kuwait is wrong. That's not the answer. I don't want to sound like I'm an apologist for Saddam Hussein. But on the flip side of it, blowing Iraq up and smashing all its bridges, blowing up its schools, tearing up its government buildings, and wrecking the place probably also isn't the answer in the other direction. So, this problem that we have in our world is a wrong is committed, and then the response to fix the wrong is to do another wrong. That doesn't make the world a better place. Kuwait could have easily been liberated from Iraq without blowing Iraq up. There was no need to do the kind of destruction that was done. I mean, We're talking about an international force. The Egyptian army's there, the Syrians sent troops, the Saudis are there, the French are there, the British are there, the Americans are there. Like there's nothing in the world that Saddam Hussein could have done to prevent the military capture of Kuwait. The bombing campaign that the United States unleashes on Iraq for 1 month, we bombed the hell out of the country, has no reasonable explanation other than we just wanted to test weapon systems and kill as many people as we could. And I think the result was to kind of shock and horrify the world. Like, what was that for? This was so excessive. In any case, that's what we do. The second war is even more irrational. Like, at least in the case of the first war, you can say, well, we were liberating Kuwait. In the case of the second war, there is no explanation for it. So in the aftermath of the first war, the United States announced, George Bush Sr. announced, that as soon as Iraq got rid of its weapons of mass destruction, it would be let back into the community of countries, right? The Iraqis misunderstood what was being said. They misinterpreted. They took their chemical weapons out into the desert in multiple sites and blew them up. They did this in August of 1991. So the war had ended, like 6 months earlier. The Iraqis go out in the desert, they blow up all these chemical warheads, and they think they're done. And then the UN weapons inspection regime shows up. First of all, chemical weapons aren't a weapon of mass destruction. They're a terror weapon. The number of people killed by them is actually shockingly low. It's just a horrific, horrible death that's scary. Weapons of mass destruction are nukes and biological weapons. Also, you can use conventional weapons as a weapon of mass destruction. We killed 20,000 people when we firebombed the city of Dresden in World War II. I think burning 20,000 people alive, it constitutes a weapon of mass destruction at that point, right? Obviously, we killed a lot more people when we nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but you can even turn a conventional weapon into a weapon of mass destruction. In any case, we'll use the terminology because that's the terminology everybody uses, even though it's wrong, and I just want to be clear that it's wrong. The UN weapons inspection team shows up, and they're like, where are the warheads? And Iraq goes, we don't have any. And they whip out the receipts. Who delivered those VX, sarin gas, mustard gas warheads, nerve gas warheads to the Iraqis? It was the United States during the Iran-Iraq war. So they had the serial numbers for every single rocket. We just handed over the receipts. So the UN weapons inspection team says, okay, we have to find the serial numbers. And the Iraqis go, you're kidding. We blew that stuff up. And the weapons team goes, show us where you blew it up. We're going to sift the sand to find the little metal serial numbers so we can check them off. By 1998, Scott Ritter, a U.S. Marine, who was the guy leading the inspection team at that point, had confirmed that he found 98% of the serial numbers. The life expectancy of those weapons were expired. They were past their expiration date. But Bill Clinton was in the middle of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He needed to distract the American public, so he ordered the UN weapons inspection team out so he could bomb Iraq. He does it, and then Saddam Hussein goes, that's it. We were clean. You knew we were clean. You're playing dirty. I'm not letting the weapons inspection team back in. In 2002, George Bush Jr. threatens to go to war. Saddam Hussein lets the weapons inspection team back in because he doesn't want to get bombed. He gets bombed anyway, and we go to war a second round for weapons we knew they never had because Scott Ritter had identified 98%. You got to figure when you're blowing up warheads, some of those serial numbers are going to melt or be shredded. 98% shocks me. I can't believe they found 98%. At that point, I would have treated that as a clean bill of health, but obviously Bill Clinton didn't care about that. He was like wag the dog kind of situation, create a distraction for the public. Why George Bush Jr. did the second war may be explained by a thing called the Project for the Neo-American Century. What happened was a group of conservatives in the United States had actually written a series of letters to Bill Clinton beginning in 1998, and then they ended up part of the George Bush Senior or George Bush Jr. government. And those letters said that what the United States ought to do is invade Iraq, conquer it, turn it into a base of operations, and then either invade Syria or Iran next, conquer those two, because whichever you only didn't do second, you'll do third. Then the United States is going to invade and conquer Saudi Arabia. So the plan was to backstab Saudi Arabia and then invade and conquer Egypt. And in the process, encircle Israel, secure Israel, make it safe, and then change the borders of the region to create even more divisions. And like I've seen the map, it's crazy. They were going to split the Hejaz off of Najd and make it so that there were at least 2 states where Saudi Arabia was. They were going to carve Iraq up into 3 states. They were going to carve Syria up. And the goal was to just make it so that the United States would now have an imperial foothold in the Middle East. The United States military named the Middle East CENTCOM, as in Central Command. So the United States isn't Central Command. The United States is NORTHCOM. It's North Command. The center of the United States is the Middle East. And that was the mentality that they brought into that war. Of course, it turned into a disaster, and the Iraqi people, Vietnamed the United States, and the United States left humiliated and in disgrace. The United States got Vietnamed by Afghanistan as well. So it ended up being completely catastrophic for the United States empire in the end. But the loss in life and the loss to the global economy is also catastrophic.
Okay, look, we are running out of time, so I would love to discuss a lot more with you. We only are, I mean, we've discussed Iraq 2003, but we still really have to discuss the 90s and 2000s and 2010s in a bunch of other countries. But we are running out of time, but we'll have this discussion again at some point. But I just want to ask you before you leave, specifically with regards the tactics used by the USA throughout the region, but specifically in terms of bombing Iraq in both 91 and 2003. When you look at how Israel is really bombed Gaza completely and utterly, the amount of firepower they've used, the amount of firepower they're using in Lebanon, how much do you think Israel have taken a playbook out of the US and their actions in the region?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's complicated because one of the things that's different about what Israel is doing is Israel has a colonial settler project, whereas the United States didn't have a colonial settler project in Iraq. I mean, there were members in the Bush administration who imagined that they would send in missionaries and convert Iraqis to Christianity, but they pretty quickly realized that wasn't going to happen. And the irony is that the number of Christians in Iraq dramatically dropped because a lot of them ended up being refugees who left. So more ethnic cleansing is what they ended up creating. In the case of Israel, the settler colonial project is that the Palestinian population needs to be not completely displaced, right? Because you need them for a labor force, but it needs to be largely displaced so that the land can be turned over to Israeli settlers. So what's happening right now, it's on a large scale and it's quite brutal, but it has a very different goal in mind than what the United States was trying to achieve. So the playbook is similar, but not exactly the same. In both cases, though, the result is shockingly similar, right? In both cases, it was genocide on a grand scale. In the case of Iraq, the United States murdered somewhere between 1.3 to 2 million Iraqis. And you can't explain to me why, right? Like, why did we do this? There's no answer. In the case of what the Israelis are doing, last time I checked, I have to be careful with how much I check the news so that I can, prevent myself from screaming and gouging my eyes out as I run through the street. But last time I checked, I think we were at 45,000 dead Palestinians in Gaza. That's a huge portion of the population. And so from a proportional standpoint, it has to be classified as a war crime and a crime against humanity, just like the US war against Iraq was. Just the outcome, the goal is obviously very different. what gets me is that in Europe and the United States, there just isn't that much upset. So don't get me wrong, some places have definitely come out on the side of Palestine, Norway, Ireland, Spain, for example. There's definitely been demonstrations. There have definitely been people who have spoken up. One of the interesting things that I've noticed is Jewish Americans, especially from Gen Z, have been outraged about what Israel is doing, and they've been standing up against it and speaking out. But as a general rule, Europe and the United States have been shockingly quiet about this. And that was true during the Iraq War. Like, here we are clearly committing genocide for no explainable reason. And the average person just seemed to be okay with it. It was just par for the course. To make things more complicated and put things in a larger scale, there's 22 members of the League of Arab States. I might be wrong about that, but that's the number in my head. Throw in Chad, which is majority Arab, and then throw in Eritrea. So you have 24 Arab states. 8 of them are in ruins. They're a smoldering heap of hell. The Sudan, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. 1/3 of Arab states are burnt to the ground. Name another place on the planet that has this. There's nothing like this in South America. There's nothing like this in sub-Saharan Africa. There's nothing like this going on in Asia. The only other place that's in turmoil is the Ukraine-Russia war. Arabs are 6% of the world's population. They're 50% of the world's refugees. We are in the middle of the worst refugee crisis in human history. So for me, the scale of this is not only insane in terms of the death toll, it's insane in terms of the lack of response amongst people that we would identify as white. They just don't seem to care that when Arabs die. It's nothing new, right? The Palestine-Israel conflict is 76 years old. Like I keep saying, people angry at Kamala Harris for genocide. It's like, dude, this is 76 years. You need to be mad at Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, Nixon, LBJ. Like, why are you suddenly mad at this one random person? There's this large picture here. There was Iraq. Why aren't you mad at Bush? Why aren't we putting Bush on trial for crimes against humanity? I think there's a fundamental flaw in the way people see the world that goes through the lens of 2 things: nationalism, which clouds people's brains, and trauma. And people aren't developed enough to set aside some of that trauma to have enough compassion to go, oh my God, murdering children is just never okay. It's never the answer. Blowing up whole cities is just never the answer. I mean, what's strange about this too is the Israelis are saying we're defending ourselves. How are you defending yourselves when you're attacking somebody? Like the logic of it is beyond ludicrous. You know, we're being violent to prevent violence kind of logic when you're the settler colonial project committing the violence to begin with because you're trying to take away somebody else's country. Here's the real tragedy of all of this for me: the Abraham Accords. There was a distinct attempt by so many Arab states to try to normalize relations with the hope that through dialogue, some kind of solution could be achieved. That at some point, Israel could be normalized into the Middle East and that there would be a solution for the Palestinian population. It might be 50 years from now, but that was the goal, that was the hope. Now, some people will hate this, some people will love this. I don't care. There was a hint of a possibility of Israel having normalized relations. I don't see how that happens now. And so one of the weird things about all of this trauma and nationalism and crazy is that I think Israel has painted itself into a corner where negotiating its way out is going to be really difficult. My fear is that instead of cool heads prevailing and that we find some kind of solution for the Israelis and the Palestinians that results in a peaceful let's trade, let's have hummus together kind of outcome, that this is just going to keep festering and it's going to just keep constantly being this open wound that nobody is serious about healing, that the United States or China or Russia uses to keep the Arab world in a state of chaos and division. And so I hate to end it on that note, but that's what it looks like to me.
Professor Roy Casagranda, thank you so much. We did run out of time and we had to abbreviate the last part of the conversation. So we will have that conversation at some point. But thank you so much for your time and best of luck with everything.
You know what? I want to say one more thing just
Go for it. Go for it.
Bring it home. Yeah. So I'm a member of the Varna Peace Institute. And I wasn't there when this happened, but they invited Ilan Pappé to Berlin. And if you get a chance, I think his talk is amazing. He talks about the Israeli project as a colonial settler project. But he says something that I think everybody needs to kind of hear. And he goes, there's no doubt Israel's on the wrong side of this. And then he says, but my children are Israelis. In other words, I think this is a really important thing that everybody needs to remember, that even when people are doing something that's wrong, there's still humans on the other side. There's no just solution that doesn't include a just solution for the Israelis. We need to figure out a way to get people to stop murdering each other so we can have the conversations that lead to that. And I don't know how to get there right now, but I hope people will keep that as their, as part of this. Yeah, what's happening is wrong, but there still needs to be a just solution on the other side. And it's hard to imagine. That's my hope.
Do you have time for one?
Sure, go for it. We have to. I know I'm over, but
right. I mean, okay. Look, I mean, the thing is, I spoke to a guest last week, and I think this idea is picking up precisely because of the extreme reaction that we've seen to Israel, in addition to the 76 years of occupation and random brutalizations. The Crusaders eventually were needed to be ejected from Europe. They weren't able to actually just become part of the society. I guess over the 200-year period, there were periods where they did kind of, where certain Crusader tribes or people or phases sort of befriended the population, and there were alliances and normalization occurred between various Arab kings and the Crusaders. But eventually, their sheer brutality meant they were seen as this other entity. And eventually they left. They were made to leave and chose to leave the region. Is Israel not creating a similar fait accompli for themselves?
So that is exactly what I think is happening, right? The Abraham Accords, we're trying to figure out how do we normalize and just make it so you can be here peacefully. The unfortunate thing is the violence that's happening now has reached a point where it feels like, how does this end without just more bloodshed? What I'm hoping happens is that, obviously it's probably not going to happen with Netanyahu, but that whoever the next Israeli prime minister is, that guy does what F.W. de Klerk did in 1987, and that was he began negotiating with the ANC secretly to surrender. And what my hope is that the Israelis realize we're still powerful, we're still in a position where we can negotiate, and they begin the secret negotiation, surrender. And in that case, I don't think there has to be an ejection. I don't think there has to be another refugee crisis. And I hope there isn't, actually. I hope the Israelis stay. What I hope happens is that there's a truth and reconciliation process like there was in South Africa. And that in the end, this two-state solution thing is done. There's just no two ways about it. I don't care. Everybody keeps talking about it. It's stupid. It makes no goddamn sense. So Palestine isn't a state. It's a skin rash. The only outcome that's a just outcome is what South Africa did, a single-state solution. It needs to be a single secular state with safeguards built in for the Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Druze populations so that everybody can feel calm and safe and comfortable in that space. Any other outcome is still just apartheid. And so at the end of the day, what I'm hoping happens is the Israelis calm down, stop acting out of trauma, and begin serious surrender negotiations to create a single secular state whether that happens or not, and we end up with a crusader-like outcome, I mean, that's unfortunately that's on the table, and it's stupid. That doesn't solve anything.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. I think now we have concluded.
I have to go.
Yeah, no worries. So listen, we will have a conversation at some other point. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for letting me have this opportunity to speak to you.
Excellent.